Hi, I'm Bob Orrin. Welcome to another edition of Washington Unplugged and Flashpoints with our national security analyst, Juan Zarate. Juan, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Bob.
Let's start with Israel and Palestine. This has been really at the center of the administration's focus the last couple of weeks. We know about the Netanyahu visit and the Chile speech and all of that. What's going on here?
What we have here, Bob, is a race to September, really a race to see what happens before the potential UN vote on Palestinian statehood. This is why I think President Obama stuck in his speech a rather controversial line about the 1967 borders. He's trying to push the Israelis and push the peace process forward before you get to this moment in September where the United States may have to veto the desire by the Palestinians to have their state declared by the General Assembly at the UN. This is why the Israelis are resistant. They're feeling encircled. They're also feeling a little bit vulnerable, not understanding quite what's happening on the Palestinian side with the unity deal with Fatah, the ruling part of the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas. And so really you have an unsettled process here, and a real question as to whether or not, in the context of the Arab Spring, you're going to see a new intifada arise from the Palestinian side, a wave of civilian protesters like we saw recently toward the borders of Israel, sort of literally taking their state back while you have this diplomatic process at the UN. So this is quite unsettled. No hopes that I've heard of or seen with respect to the peace process, and really marching toward a controversial September in the region.
I was going to say, I don't even see a track where you might get the peace process going again. So really, aren't we kind of inevitably going towards this UN showdown?
Well, I think so. And this is one of the criticisms of the president's speech and injecting in the 1967 borders as the baseline, because at the same time he was doing this, George Mitchell was stepping down as his peace envoy. No real prospects for peace, and certainly on the Palestinian side, no signals that they're willing to sit down with the Israelis, even if the Israelis decided to give up on certain conditions in the border issues. So it's really an unsettled time, and I think this is a new dimension of the Arab Spring we have to watch very carefully, because we could have conflict erupt between the Palestinians and the Israelis come September when this vote happens at the UN.
If anything, on either side, it looks almost more hardline than it was. There doesn't seem to be any movement towards the middle.
No, that's right. I think positions have hardened. I think now with the unity deal with the Palestinians and the Hamas faction now a part of it, their line is hardened. President Abbas has been fairly hardline in what he has said. We heard Prime Minister Netanyahu before the Congress laying out pretty straightforward and hardline views in terms of what Israel was asking for and is demanding in a peace process. But there is just no process. And so we're faced with a real prospect of a conflict emerging in September as a result of this vote, and to see what happens among the Palestinian people, whether or not there is a new intifada that emerges.
Week to week, if we had to pick a number one flashpoint, it would probably be Pakistan. It seems that most important things kind of start and end there. We saw what happened with Secretary of State Clinton and the chairman Mullen in Pakistan. Very tough meeting, but they seem to kind of lay down the law, at least privately, to the Pakistanis. Where is our relationship with Pakistan as it relates to trying to go forward with this war against terror?
Well, I think it's incredibly tense still. I don't think it's going to get better anytime soon, but you do have those diplomatic fig leaves out there. Secretary Clinton and Chairman Mullen were out there, as you said, trying to give the Pakistanis some breathing space. But in many ways, the Pakistanis feel themselves to be in the crosshairs. They're still greatly embarrassed as a result of the UBL killing, both in the sense that Osama bin Laden was found so close to their capital, but also that the Americans came in unilaterally. Pakistanis weren't able to defend against the incursion, and so the military's been embarrassed. Plus, you now have over 20 attacks on Pakistani establishment sites, including this naval base in Karachi, which is seen as a real embarrassment to the military, and now an arrest of a former Navy official who seems to have been an insider implicated now in this attack. And so real questions as to whether or not the military is sound internally, whether or not they can defend externally, and at a time when there's likely to be more tension, not just from the Americans, but also tension from within, given some of these militant attacks.
Radicals have taken this moment, it seems, to kind of raise the stakes for Pakistan. Some of these attacks look to be retaliatory, but they're kind of poking their finger in the eye here.
Absolutely. I think they're taking the moment to take advantage of the internal pressure and fissures and unpopularity of the civilian government in particular, and the loss of some legitimacy on the part of the military and intelligence services. So the militants are taking full advantage. What's interesting, though, Bob, is you're seeing a bit of a reaction now from the military, not just against the United States. We've seen some of that tit for tat publicly. But now you've seen attacks in Orakzai, one of the provinces, by the military going after the militants. You also have word now, some reports that the Pakistanis are preparing to go into North Waziristan, where they haven't gone in to date.
We've wanted them to do that for a while.
Where the Americans, and we've been pushing them very hard. And so you may see some signs of the Pakistani military starting to push back and lash out in a way that may be beneficial to the United States. I just think it's going to grow harder over time with the pullout of troops in Afghanistan, the Pakistanis trying to weigh the balance with India and with China, and also with the fact that we're likely to come up with more information about the locality of places like, of guys like Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda's number 2, and others, where we may have to act unilaterally again. And so that's going to create tension yet again. And so this isn't going to get any easier, but hopefully we're going to see little steps here and there, baby steps in the relationship to make things at least a little bit better. But this is going to be tense for a long time, and as you said, this could be a topic every week for us on Flashpoint.
Before we leave Pakistan, there's one more factor, and that is this trial in Chicago where David Headley, the American jihadist, is testifying about alleged relationships he had with elements in terror groups that were connected, he says, to Pakistani intelligence. How much damage has Headley done? Has he told us anything that we didn't know before?
Well, Bob, this is something you've covered very well, and I would commend people to your reports on CBSNews.com. This is another place where Pakistan's in the crosshairs, and in many ways, Pakistan is just as much in the defendant's seat as this guy Rana is, because there have been indications of Pakistani official involvement in the Mumbai attacks. What you have being revealed now through David Headley, albeit he's suspect, what he is revealing is that the Pakistani intelligence services, the ISI, was actually part of the handling of the terrorists who then executed the Mumbai attacks. And so he is in open court laying out the foundations for Pakistani complicity with the Lashkar-e-Taiba and other terrorists who were involved in the Mumbai attacks. That's explosive. That confirms, for example, all the things the Indians have been saying. It's something that's being watched very closely, and it's another example of where the Pakistani system and government is in the crosshairs. There's
a lot to talk about with Pakistan. Well, let's move on now to Iran and Syria. The atomic regulators came out with a report that didn't get a lot of publicity relating to Syria.
Right. IAEA came out with a report, very important because it again signals suspicions as to what the Iranians are doing. This now follows a series of reports that the IAEA has put out suggesting that the Iranians aren't being fully transparent. They're engaged in certain activities that appear suspect and quite problematic from their perspective and the international community's perspective. With respect to Syria, what they did was to talk about prior Syrian activity, which appears to confirm what we've known now, given President Bush's book and other indications, that the Syrians were engaged in final stage efforts of establishing a nuclear program and a nuclear site, which all indications suggest the Israelis destroyed a couple of years ago. President Bush laid this out in his book, Decision Points. So this is the first time the IAEA has kind of resolved on that issue, something that American officials have wanted the IAEA to declare for some time. And it also suggests, again, this unhappy, unholy alliance between Syria and North Korea, where the North Koreans were supporting the establishment of this nuclear program. Very important in terms of counterproliferation, in terms of the nuclear program, in terms of security in the region, and it suggests why people are worried about what the Assad regime is doing in Damascus. Interestingly, Bob, at the same time you had the European Union putting sanctions, further sanctions on President Assad and elements of the Syrian government, and then the American government putting further sanctions on Iran, as well as those supporting Iran, to include the Venezuelan oil company PDVSA, which didn't get much coverage but was an important step to signal the growing ties between Venezuela and Iran.
Very troubling because, of course, Venezuela in the Western Hemisphere is really on our doorstep.
Absolutely, and one of the concerns that you've had is not just the growing commercial relationships and other relationships between Iran and Venezuela, but the potential that you have Iranian intelligence officers from the Revolutionary Guard Corps or even Hezbollah members infiltrating the hemisphere through Venezuela. Lots of folks have been writing on this. Hasn't gotten a lot of public attention, but it's certainly an area of concern. And I think the American government was starting to signal that concern with the designation of PDVSA as part of the Iran sanctions.
Well, we'll watch that one going forward, too. And, of course, we've talked a lot about the Arab Spring. One really troubled spot appears to be Yemen. This is a situation where the president there, he will not go. He signaled he might go, and he keeps pulling that back. And now it looks to me like they might be going towards civil war here.
Yeah, you may have the unraveling of Yemen here and civil war really on the doorstep of the Arabian Gulf. I think this is probably the most problematic country in terms of the Arab Spring, because you have not only the potential that this country will devolve into a failed state, which many argue it was already close to being anyway, with the rebellion in the north, rebellion in the south, and al-Qaeda there, but also a growing al-Qaeda movement and base of operations for what you know and what officials have said to be the most dangerous of the al-Qaeda affiliates, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. This is the one with Anwar al-Awlaki, the Yemeni-American cleric, Waishi, the longtime al-Qaeda UBL bin Laden associate running it. And so you really have the potential. You have a failed state with a very strong al-Qaeda affiliate taking over. And now what you have is increasing violence and militants taking over towns. And so you've got some Islamist militants taking over in some southern cities, the Yemeni government taking more aggressive actions against protesters, and really what appears to be an unraveling situation, which may be the most dangerous situation of the Arab Spring.
And the most immediate effect on this country, of course, could be that it gives al-Qaeda a bigger safe haven there.
That's absolutely right. The more room to maneuver, the more room there is to train or to plot, the more dangerous for the United States. Mike Leiter, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, has said that the most dangerous threat to the United States comes from that group in Yemen. And so to the extent that they have control of more territory, more sympathies, more ability to operate, that's dangerous for the United States directly. You know who else is worried? Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was worried about instability on its doorstep. It's worried about Iran meddling in the region. It's worried about al-Qaeda gaining strength and momentum in the southern part of its border. And so Saudi Arabia is going to be watching this very carefully. And I would not be surprised if you started to see more Saudi involvement overtly.
And one last point, and then we'll wrap it up here. Should we expect, do you think, to see more U.S. unilateral action in Yemen? We've seen a number of drone strikes now in the wake of the bin Laden raid. Knowing about the unrest there, are we going to be a little more aggressive there?
I think you should anticipate that. I think what we saw was an attempted strike at Anwar al-Awlaki that failed, unfortunately. But you're going to see with the Yemeni security forces sort of reassembling to defend Sala, the growing militancy in the south, questions as to what's going on with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, you're going to see more aggressive U.S. activities. And I think in the wake of the UBL killing, I think there's a little bit of wind in the sails of American counterterrorism officials to feel a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more brazen in terms of taking matters into their own hands. And I think that goes not just for Pakistan, but also for Yemen.
All right, Juan, as always, thanks. Very interesting.
Thank you,
and
Bob.
We'll look for you next time.
Appreciate it.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. Have a good day.